Growing up in the 90s, my childhood existed in an era before streaming services, largely before high-speed internet, and before online piracy ran as rampant as it does today. Back then, if I wanted to see a new show or movie, my options were considerably more limited than they are today. If I wanted to discover something new and watch it from start to finish this weekend, I could simply search for shows or movies similar to what I've previously watched on Netflix, or Hulu, or Amazon Prime, or Tubi, and I'll be met with a laundry list of other media I might find interesting. Back then, however, I had two options: score a VHS off my brother or his friends, or visit the video store on Friday after school. Where I grew up in the country of the southern United States, we didn't have easy access to a lot of big brand companies and stores, at least not until I was in high school, when the area was considered large enough to warrant these encroachments. In the 90s and early 2000s, we would have had to drive half an hour to arrive at the nearest Blockbuster, so that was out of the question. Other chains like Hollywood Video didn't even exist in our area. My brother had a job at a movie theater right by the nearest Blockbuster, and he would occasionally bring home discount secondhand tapes they would sell off after not renting well consistently. This was how I first learned about My Neighbor Totoro, when he brought home a beat-up VHS of the film dubbed in English, without its clamshell case or even a proper cardboard slipcover, instead replaced with a generic Blockbuster box. This was before I even really knew what anime was. I didn't know where animation was produced. All I knew was that this looked different from most of what I saw on television stylistically, but my childhood mind couldn't comprehend what set it apart. Examples like this were few and far between, however. On a more regular basis, my sister and I would get out of school on Friday afternoon and visit the locally owned video store with our mother. We were far enough apart in age that our older siblings weren't regularly a part of this excursion, which was all the better for my sister and I. The local store had a deal where members could rent 5 tapes that weren't considered new releases for 5 days, and only pay $5. Mom would get a movie, and my sister and I would each rent 2. This was the era of childhood, where you can watch the same movie or TV episodes over and over in only a few days and not get burnt out. So 2 tapes meant hours upon hours of entertainment for the entire weekend. Other times, my mother and I would swap. She would get 2 tapes, while I would only get 1, in addition to a video game. One to play on my brother's N64, or the family's PlayStation. After leaving the local video store, we would get a few pizzas and a 2-liter from the chain pizza joint across the street, and then head home. My parents' house at this time was out in the middle of nowhere, while paradoxically being within 20 minutes of town. It's one of those things about your hometown that you hate as a kid but learn to appreciate as you get older. Now that I have a driver's license and a car, and I'm not hopped up on the energy of my childhood and teenage years, I'm enchanted by the idea of being able to experience borderline pure nature so close to the conveniences of modern living. As a child, however, I couldn't stand the fact that most of my friends grew up in the recently springing up cookie-cutter subdivisions. I couldn't appreciate at that age that my father had designed and built the house in which I grew up. Instead, more interested in being able to hop on my bike and take a brisk ride to one of my classmates' houses at any hour of the day. Unless I joined my mother on trips into town for yard sales, grocery shopping, or the ever-elusive mall trip, these took at least a 40-minute drive, meaning they only occurred once every few months. I was more or less stuck at home on the weekends. Sleepovers with friends would happen every now and again, of course, but my strongest memories at this point in time are the countless hours spent at home alone. Being a kid who didn't sleep much, I would stay up late munching on pizza and sipping on soda, watching the movies and shows I had rented on loop, or else playing the game I had borrowed late into the night. Late being in quotes because as a kid I considered 10 p.m. to be absurdly late. I've always been an early riser, so Saturday morning would come, and I would slink downstairs and into my parents' room before anyone else was awake. I didn't have my own TV until middle school, meaning that as a kid I had to use someone else's for Saturday morning cartoons, keeping the volume deathly low and my nose close to the screen, trying to keep it down while I finished the 2-liter of soda and snacked on fridge-cold pizza. I found myself discovering any number of shows for the first time. At this point in time, my parents had a borderline religious opposition to acquiring a cable subscription. They had grown up in a time when broadcast television was the only option at their disposal, and they didn't seem to catch on when cable became a reality. This means that my childhood was again removed from all of my classmates. If I wanted to watch any show from cable, I again had 2 options: In this case, making use of hotel televisions while on vacation, or acquiring recorded VHS tapes from my brother's friends who actually had cable and a similar interest in media to myself. The former usually resulted in me being able to catch the odd episode of Dragon Ball Z on Toonami, or Ed, Edd and Eddy on Cartoon Network. These attempts at spying the secret world of cable were usually met with annoyance from my parents. We came all the way out to wherever we had traveled, and all I wanted to do was watch TV. Of course, this is to say nothing of their own interest in watching the Discovery Channel or History Channel at night once we had gotten back to the hotel room. The tapes from my brother's friends were also slow to arrive, mostly being second-hand from my brother himself. He would want a specific half-hour show, and his friends would record a 3-hour block to ensure that they would capture that specific show. Once he was done with the VHS, it would fall into my hands, and I would have this rare gem, a block of 6 random episodes of The Brak Show, Space Ghost Coast to Coast, Aqua Teen Hunger Force, and other shows I don't recall. Episodes which, in all likelihood, most viewers wouldn't recall themselves, but which I had rewatched so many times I could have likely quoted them. And then we have my sizable collection of Rugrats tapes. In spite of never seeing an episode on Nickelodeon proper, I loved that show so much that I had my brother buy up every tape from that distant blockbuster whenever they were available for sale. Aside from these exceptions with cable, my normal animation consumption consisted of evening syndicated broadcasts of The Simpsons, and these Saturday morning cartoons. The only times in which I could typically watch any sort of animation on TV. Without cable, this was relegated to mostly Fox and WB, and the lion's share of my Saturdays fell to WB. Alongside Western shows like Jackie Chan Adventures, Mucha Lucha, and Shaolin Showdown, my late 90s, early 2000s Saturday mornings were spent discovering Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh!, and Card Captors, 3 of the biggest influences on my early taste in anime. They presented a seemingly endless world of animation that I couldn't possibly understand. At the time, I had no idea that Pokemon would run for decades, nor that Cardcaptor Sakura ran in total for less than 100 episodes. I distinctly remember the conclusion of Yu-Gi-Oh's first arc eliciting confusion in me. Wasn't that the whole show? Pegasus was the big bad, and now that he was gone, it was surely over, right? Over the years, I didn't keep up with any of these franchises consistently, but those deathly quiet Saturday mornings spent in front of the family TV, captivated by this new style of animation and storytelling, had already planted the seed that would grow into a lifelong interest in Japanese animation, Japanese media, and Japanese culture at large. At the age of 8, we had a family vacation across the country to Washington. I was so young that I barely remember the trip, but 2 solid memories remain. My father and one of his brothers giggling like children over a dirty anime book they had found in a large bookstore. I was too young to comprehend the idea of a waifu, or even sexual attraction for that matter, so I couldn't understand what was so funny about anime girls barely wearing any clothing. The other memory that remains is the sheer excitement I experienced from buying my first deck of Yu-Gi-Oh cards, one of the first 2 released in America, and a deck based upon that of the show's protagonist, Yugi. We had visited some random mall in Washington, and my parents bought me this deck from a store so tiny that I'm not entirely sure it wasn't just a mall kiosk, but one which displayed other random anime and manga paraphernalia. I wasn't interested in all those books and pictures whose text I couldn't read. Yu-Gi-Oh had so sank its hooks into me that I was more interested in acquiring my first holographic Dark Magician. A lot of my memories from this point in childhood revolved around these seemingly mysterious shows which had overtaken my life. Several years earlier, I joined my father for a Take Your Kid to Work day. Vaguely, I can recall following him up to his cubicle in an office building high-rise. He had a key fob on a retractable cord connected to his belt loop, and he had to buzz us in through virtually every door we entered. I remember heading upstairs and sitting beside him for hours on end while he completed his programming and systems maintenance duties for the day. More clearly, though, I recall how the entire time I was beside him, I was simultaneously trekking through Mount Moon in Pokemon Blue, battling countless Zubats and Geodudes on my journey through the Kanto region. My eyes were glued to the dim screen on the family's clear plastic Game Boy Pocket, progressing further in the game as I dove deeper into the summertime obsession in spite of my out-of-the-ordinary surroundings. Perhaps a year after this, we went on a road trip as a family. I believe this was cross-country to a family reunion, where I recall jealously eyeing my cousin's Dragon Ball trading cards, realizing they had access to Cartoon Network and Toonami. In truth, however, I don't recall exactly which vacation this was. Instead, the strongest memory from this trip was that before heading out, we stopped at a Target where I was allowed to buy a copy of Pokemon Silver, the game which distracted me during the entire car ride, and a car charger for the Game Boy Pocket. Rather than observing the American countryside as we trucked along from one region to the boonies of another, I was far more interested in beginning my journey through Johto. In middle school, my interest in these popular anime syndicated on Saturday morning American television blossomed into a wider interest in the medium. The video store I had visited with my family since the era of the Super Nintendo had always stockpiled one section of one wall for anime VHS tapes. The majority of these were daunting to my young mind. Ninja Scroll, Bubblegum Crisis, the entirety of Neon Genesis Evangelion. They looked like the shows I watched on TV, but many bore a label denoting, in spite of their unrated status, that they were intended for audiences 18 and up. As a kid, I kept my interests away from these scary titles, instead traveling to the kids section, or the action section, where I would rent the same Jackie Chan movies for the third time over. This changed when I got sick in 7th grade. At the age of 12, I found myself bedridden for the better part of a week. Like usual at this point in my life, I don't recall what I had contracted, but instead the bulk of what I consumed at this time. My brother had borrowed the DVD box set of Evangelion from the same friends who made Adult Swim VHSs for him, and he handed it over, insisting that it was the greatest show I would ever see. Needless to say, 12 was perhaps too tender an age to see Eva for the first time, particularly the sequel film, End of Evangelion. But the damage was done, for better and for worse. By now, my friends and friends of the family were acquiring high-speed internet connections, and peer-to-peer file sharing was on the rise. This was the age of Napster, LimeWire, Direct Connect. Being stuck almost in the boonies, we didn't have this luxury, but my brother's friends, being in their late teens, had no compunction about downloading countless anime series amidst the explosion in popularity of shows being unofficially subtitled by fans. It was still a niche market, but the floodgates keeping anime from the West were starting to show their wear more and more, day by day. This was the era of anime like Naruto, my personal show of interest at the time, becoming available to English speakers before they ought to have officially. Prior to the show even becoming known prominently in America, I was offered the first 50 episodes, all that had aired on Japanese TV at that time, by a friend of my brother. Once I ran out of episodes, I took to acquiring scanned and translated pages of the Naruto manga, which was several years ahead of the anime, offering more content for my young mind. Perhaps too much content, as I eventually got bored and stopped reading it. 7th grade was marked by 3 things for me: seeing Evangelion for the first time while sick, seeing my first fan-subbed anime, and sitting next to a Korean exchange student in class, who told me in broken English who Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il were, and who waited until the last day of the year to tell the class we had been pronouncing his family name wrong the entire year. Most of my time spent online at this point was done so learning about rumors for N64 games, like The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, or reading cheesy fanfiction for shows like Cardcaptor Sakura, or investigating anime I had heard of. While the video store anime seemed scary to me, given their adults-only labels, another source of obscure tapes was available to me. My brother was something of a collector of cheap, second-hand VHSs, hence him offering me Totoro and volumes of Rugrats. My favorites from his plastic tubs of tapes as a kid were the Jackie Chan films, Police Story, Twin Dragons, Who Am I?, First Strike, but as I got a little older, I became intrigued with the random anime that he had. The films like Akira Kurosawa's Ran were still too intimidating for me, but the anime seemed accessible. These would be single volumes, usually out of sequence, of series which ran for 13 or 26 episodes. At the time, tapes would retail for $30 or more, and he was merely acquiring all he could at a discount. This meant that as I delved into these anime, I was seeing 3 or 4 random episodes from shows neither I nor my friends had ever heard of. Experiences like seeing episodes 4 through 9 of El Hazard The Wanderers and episodes 4 through 6 of Serial Experiments Lane stick out as both disorienting and captivating. It was a time when options were so scarce that I had to take these opportunities as they came. Not long after, new avenues opened up, which maintained an air of illegality, akin to finding those first seasons of Naruto, with some help from others. eBay had been on the rise as the world's marketplace for a few years at this point, meaning that I would occasionally peruse its catalog of available goods for memorabilia related to my favorite shows and movies. One of my friends showed me around the time of 7th or 8th grade that you could acquire surprisingly high-quality anime DVD box sets for a fraction of their American market value on the site. But something was different about these. They came in clear plastic slipcases and paperboard digipacks rather than proper DVD cases. Those obscure shows from my brother's VHS bins were at last open to me for a price reasonable enough to fit my allowance after a few months of saving. In no time, I was experiencing not just The Wanderers, but all 3 El Hazard series, and sharing them with my friends, as well as Serial Experiments Lane, a DVD set I've held onto to this day. As high school approached, my avenues for exploring anime and Japanese film opened up even further. My friends got high-speed internet access, and were willing to provide me with shows like Death Note in their entirety. Our town finally got a Blockbuster, whose DVD section far outpaced the local stores in both quantity and quality, not to mention their bundled mail-order DVD service set up to compete with Netflix's original business model. It was through these methods that I first discovered directors like Shion Sono and Takashi Miike, just a few of the Japanese directors whose work would come to dominate my interests in the coming years. By the time my second semester of junior year of high school began, our remote location had finally acquired Ethernet access. I say finally, but I know a good portion of our country still lacks this luxury. I recall one snowy morning in January 2009, with my mother watching Barack Obama's presidential inauguration on the family TV downstairs, now upgraded to a flat screen, but still a CRT nonetheless, and myself upstairs, uncovering the world of bands and artists on MySpace at speeds I could never have previously imagined. My eldest sister, upon being sent to college, was sent along with a compact desktop running Windows 95 and a 56K modem built in. When I left home for the first time, it was with a laptop running Windows 7, then the newest iteration of the OS, with built-in Wi-Fi. This transitional period between the old physical media and the new digital world was one of boundlessness and confusion, and all through these long years we had all stumbled along, trying to understand what these hidden treasures from the other side of the world truly were. Paradoxically, my increasing age brought more to my attention how physically isolated I was from others. The summer between 8th and 9th grade is condensed to a single point for me. A friend had been given Kingdom Hearts 2 as a gift and finished it just before the school year let out. He passed it on to me so that I could share in the experience that all of us had anticipated since the first game several years prior, the very game that had made most of us covet PlayStation 2s in the first place. On long, lonely summer days spent inside with the lights turned off and the sun shining through my bedroom window, I would lay on my carpeted floor and look up at the chunky CRT TV that had been handed down to me by my brother when he moved out and upgraded. I remember completing the game, defeating Xemnas, and having this distinct, crushing feeling that I would never experience this moment again. Since that time, I've only played through the game one more time, about 5 years later during a winter vacation from college, where I felt equally isolated and lonely. The feeling then was similar, but definitely not the same as that forgotten day at 14, just after completing one of the worst years of my schooling life. Reminiscing on video store culture, old video game consoles being contemporary, the days of peer-to-peer file sharing and swapping burnt DVDs of fan-subbed anime, buying Chinese bootlegs of Battle Royale and Lane on eBay, all of these reflections are a bit like looking back on that day that's almost half a lifetime away at this point. It's something I'll never recapture. I don't even have photographs, home videos, diaries, nothing from that period. Just the media that's stuck around since then, and the memories I still recall from those times. It's leaps and bounds easier nowadays to find and view whatever anime or Japanese film in which you might take interest. For this reason, the modern age is doubtless more convenient and conducive to the production and release of projects like these. Looking back though, we wouldn't be here if it weren't for the generations of anime fans that came before. I was on the cusp of this modern era, meaning that I had it considerably easier than those living in the 60s, 70s, and 80s who took interest in anime. Each era is distinct in how it operates, and the memories which people alive at the time will draw from it. These just happen to be the reminiscences of someone born on the cusp of the internet, growing up in the popular inception of digital media and mass networking. Given the circumstances in which I grew up, I catalog and recall my life in terms of dates and years, with most of these years correlating to both school grades and release years for certain properties. I was raised on Saturday morning anime and the commodification of the medium in America, and born with a brain that understands things in years, meaning most of my experiences are recalled through the lens of media, rather than experiences of playing outside with friends as a kid. This is my experience, and the progenitor of what led to this channel's creation. That being said, what are your memories? What's your story?